We're going to continue now with the reading for today. Through these summer weeks, we are doing parables of the kingdom, which are mostly in Matthew chapter 13. So we're turning to Matthew chapter 13 today. And we're going to start at verse 31. There are two separate parables. Matthew 13, starting at verse 31. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that birds come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter hidden things since the creation of the world.
Thank you. Yes, we're in Matthew chapter 13, working way through these kingdom parables. The last one in the series will be in Matthew 22, but for a moment we're here in chapter 13. And Jesus is describing the way that the kingdom of heaven works. And in this sheet that we've given out, it gives you the last 2 weeks that we've had, and we'll add to it each time. Speaking of the way that the first one was the way in which the kingdom is powerful and brings great spiritual growth, God's word in particular. And last week we looked at the way in which God sows his word into our lives, but in fact there is an enemy at work to undermine that. And now we have 2 more images, mustard seed and yeast, that speak about the way in which we might think it's weak. It appears weak, but in actual fact, it isn't. And we've got sort of a sort of outline, vaguely, on the second page of this little sheet. If you want to write any questions you have or thoughts that you might want to remember, there's a space for it. There's some questions to follow up afterwards that you can think about afterwards. A prayer and just a little activity related to bread. Now, I think the bread requires a certain amount of time to prove and then bake, so I'm going to preach for the next 55 minutes until it's... I know you'd all love me to do that, but it's a summer Sunday, so it's be slightly shorter. It's important, though, these parables are really important for us because the way that this is described here is something we probably feel really profoundly. Yeah, maybe you feel, as a believer, you're out there on your own, whether that's in the workplace or school or within your own family and neighborhood. You're the only one. Or you look at us at the moment and you think, actually, there's not many of us, and the outside world is much bigger. What can we do? It's ignoring us, and we're irrelevant. Well, these 2 parables offer a particular perspective on that. Because the image of a growing seed lies at the heart of Christian belief. We saw it in the parable of the sower, and Jesus used this image of himself in John 12. The text is already on the screen. Where John, in John's Gospel, he says this, I very truly I tell you that unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Now, he was talking there about himself, first of all, and what he would do, that his death would result in many seeds of spiritual life and redemption spreading around. Of course, that one seed of him became a huge number, and if we're a follower of Jesus, then we are part of that, what he says there. But actually what he then goes on to do in the next verse is to apply it to us, that we do the same. We are like a seed. He says that whoever serves me must follow me. We must go the same way. And so to follow Jesus, what does that mean? To be like him, to do like him, maybe to die like him. That is a possibility, and we know there are believers throughout the world who have to face that. At the very least, it's dying to perhaps our own glory and thinking that we're going to be this person that's successful, and we are going to be the one who draws lots of people into the kingdom. We're going to do great things. Maybe that sort of idea has to die. But whatever it is for us, we are called to do the same. In the same way as Jesus died and produced many, we are called in the same way. So this picture of a seed becoming something far greater than its original self, producing a harvest, is the way that the kingdom works. And these parables talk about it. So here we have the mustard seed. It's this tiny, tiny seed that it seems to be nothing. It grows and it produces something out of all proportion to itself. We don't know exactly the plant that Jesus is talking about. There is something that's very similar to the idea of a small seed becoming a big tree-like bush. But it's the image that he's using of something that's tiny becoming something huge out of all proportion to what it is. I guess that's true of most seeds, actually. If you think of an acorn, it's quite a large seed, but it becomes a monstrous tree. So that's the image. So we can see that actually playing out in the Bible in some ways. On the day of Pentecost, you read it in Acts chapter 2, there were 120 people who were seeking to follow Jesus after he died and ascended into heaven. After Peter preached on the day of Pentecost, there were 3,000, and then 2,000 added more to that, and more. So the church growth in the early years was massive. Actually, it was helped by a death. If you read about Stephen was one of the key leaders in the church, very effective, yet he was arrested and then martyred. So the seed really did die. But after that, persecution broke out against the church. And it says the church was scattered. So the effect of the death of Stephen and the subsequent persecution was the scattering of the church. So instead of the church being stuck in Jerusalem, it had spread. It's a bit like trying to stop dandelions by kicking the dandelion head, isn't it? I'm going to kick it, and that will destroy it. Well, no. Believers found themselves all around the Mediterranean, planting churches and reaching new peoples. Now, that process has gone on for the last 2,000 years, and we can see it more recently in places like Iran. If you took the number of believers, Iranian believers, Persian believers, before the revolution, there were just a handful, literally just a handful. And now, people are struggling to estimate what the number actually is, 200,000. Scattered all around the world. In every capital city, there will be an Iranian church. So you can see it there happening across the world, and it's in many other places where the seed has been planted and has been thought to be finished, no good. So we can see it happening in church growth. But what about the places where it isn't happening? Where it isn't, you can't see this happening like this. There are places where the church is weak or downtrodden, parts of obviously the Muslim world, North Korea. There are lots of individual countries where the church is not growing, places where it's shrinking even. Well, if that's the case, then we believe what the parable says. We take it by faith. We live by faith, not by sight, Paul says. So the kingdom is growing, and there will be a harvest. We can't see it sometimes. And the seed that is planted seems to be irrelevant and of no consequence. But years ahead, well, we take what Jesus says here to be true, because we've seen it in some ways, and the parts where we can't see it, well, we believe it. Actually, that issue of not being able to see something at work is really what the next part is about, all about yeast. What does yeast do? It's the ingredient, isn't it, that works invisibly, unseen, and yet its presence changes everything. Without it, the dough wouldn't rise. Now, just think about the yeast for a moment. It doesn't need much. We demonstrated that here quite deliberately. 11 big spoonfuls of flour, 1 and a tiny bit of a teaspoon of yeast. Actually, I did look it up. Google tells me, I'm not the expert here, that 1 kilo of flour needs 5 grams of dry yeast, or about, approximately. Fresh yeast, a bit more you need. So 1 kilo, that's 1,000 grams, in case you're not keen on new money. 1,000 grams to 5. That's 1 in 200. 1 part in 200 is all you need. Now, maybe you feel that much outnumbered in your faith. It's quite possible, that there's nobody around you that you know is a believer at work or in your neighborhood. There probably are, but 1 in 200 is maybe how you feel. Maybe you feel that you can't do anything, or we can't do anything because we've got so few people. But God doesn't need many. It's great when he's got many, but he doesn't need many. There are so many examples in the Old Testament of that, but here's a phrase from 1 Kings. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. That's the words of Jonathan, son of Saul, encouraging the only man that would support him. That's his armor bearer, as they took on the Philistines and defeated them. God doesn't need many. And the whole principle of yeast is that there isn't much, and yet its effect is massive. Well, that's what we're praying for. Lynn and I were connected with the church in Brixworth before we moved down here. And they organized the building of a library and a community center. Initially, they thought we'd like to build a church because they were, a congregation of about 30, I suppose. Build a church. And at the same time, Daventry District Council said they'd like to build a library, which was just going to be a porter cabin in a corner, I think. Well, Phil Walters, the guy that I worked with, and he persuaded the parish councillors to think a bit higher than that. Obviously, he persuaded the church to think higher as well. Let's get together and do something together, because actually we can do something better. And in the end, they built a large library building with a large meeting room, which the church would use, and a cafe, which the church ran, and an office for Daventry District Council, all in a modern new building. And the church committed themselves to raising half the price of the building. I'm not very good on numbers for buildings that size, but you're talking several million, aren't you, that the building would cost. So they committed themselves to half of that number, between 1 and 2 million, I think it was. Now, it's another story as to how they got that, but they did. And the leader of the parish council said that she was amazed at what a small number of dedicated, committed people could achieve. And she was talking about the church, not the parish councillors. They were a small number, but actually it was the church, basically Phil's faith, Phil Walters' faith, that said, let's do it a bit bigger. And, the principle is the yeast exercises an influence on the whole, out of all proportion to what you think it could do. Here's another thing about yeast, is it can't stay in one place. It has to spread. That's why God doesn't let us stick together in one lump. I don't know what a huge lump of yeast would do to a loaf. If it was a big lump, what would it do to it? What would the loaf become? Tasteless and horrible, would it? Yeah. I don't know. You only need small, and if you think about it, well, think about it in relation to churches. You see, we're a part of a group of 6 churches, Passion for Life churches, I was trying to work out how many people there are in all the churches that meet together on a Sunday morning. I've no real idea. But let's say 200, 250 people across 6 churches. That's only 40 or so in each. I know that 3 of them at least have fewer than that every Sunday morning. So surely it would be better if instead of scattering across the area, we met in one place as one group. Well, that's fun, and we do it actually. We do meet together occasionally. We don't get 200. But it's encouraging, and it is great, and if you haven't been part of those, you are missing out on something there. But God's intention isn't to allow us to sit together in one lump, in one place, all the time. Each church, you'll notice, if you know anything about them, they're all in completely different neighborhoods, with different people around them, different communities that are touched, and so it's got a wider reach. It's better for the kingdom. It's less comfortable for us. It's even more uncomfortable because we're in a smaller church each. Yet it's better for the kingdom that we're spread. Well, we can't all stay in one place. The idea is that we spread out. A bit like salt, I suppose, actually. You don't put a great lump of salt into your recipe. You have to scatter little bits of it. Well, it can't stay in one place. That's yeast. What does it mean for us? What does this mean for us about what we're dealing with? Well, the first thing is we have to rely on the power of God. If this little seed is going to grow from the tiny thing that it is into the tree that encompasses all nations, we must rely on the power of God. It would be so much easier, wouldn't it, if we were all in one big place and the kingdom was visibly powerful. We wouldn't have to rely on God then, would we? Because it'd all be here. We'd have everything at our disposal. We'd have everything we need, all the people we want. It doesn't work like that, does it? No, when it's small, we are forced to trust God. When its influence seems to be invisible, we are forced to pray that because only God can give the growth. No one else can. So if you're concerned about the church, whether ours or anybody else's, are you actively praying to make it grow, for that tiny seed to grow, and for the influence of the yeast to work its way outwards into the wider batch of the dough? Because only his power can do that. Surely we understand that all of our inventiveness and cleverness isn't going to bring that success or growth. So we have to rely on God. And the second thing, obviously, is here's encouragement from Paul in 1 Corinthians. Your labor in the Lord is never in vain. If this is the principle at work, your labor in the Lord won't be in vain. Now, maybe all your dreams of glory and success have to die, but that doesn't mean to say there's no growth, or that your work is useless, or there's no point in doing anything. On the contrary, Jesus is telling us this is how the kingdom works. Tiny seeds, invisible influence, and an overwhelming harvest. Well, that's what we've got to pray for. You and I are part of that process. We might feel a very tiny part of it, but the good news is the tiny part produces the growth. So why don't we just give thanks for that and pray that God will give us perseverance and encouragement to keep going and to see this growth that he speaks of.